If you've been playing Ever Night Reawakening for a while, you've probably realized that throwing your strongest guardians into a team isn't always enough. As the battles get tougher, team synergy starts to matter a lot more, and picking the right guardians can be the difference between cruising through stages or getting completely stuck. With so many legend and epic guardians to choose from, figuring out who actually deserves your resources can be pretty confusing. That's exactly what we're going to cover in this video. I've ranked the top 39 meta guardians based on their overall damage, support abilities, and how well they perform as you reach the late game. Whether you're building your very first team or looking to replace a few weaker units, this tier list will help you decide who's worth investing in and who you can safely skip. So, let's jump right into the rankings. I'm quickly moving on to the video, and I'm ranking guardians in Ever Night Reawakening. Before we start, if you enjoy these types of list videos, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Enjoy watching. The guardians in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right, Bjorn, Chesia, Phoenix, Floki, Reddick, and Helen. Alright, here's where things start getting a little awkward. These guardians aren't exactly terrible, but they're also not the kind of teammates you'll be excited to bring into difficult battles. They can absolutely carry you through parts of the early game, but once stronger enemies start showing up, their weaknesses become much harder to ignore. If you invest too heavily in them, you'll probably find yourself looking for replacements sooner rather than later. Let's start with Phoenix, a legendary guardian that looks much stronger on paper than she actually performs in battle. Her entire game plan revolves around landing critical hits against single targets, thanks to her extra critical rate. The problem is that if those critical hits don't happen, her damage falls off a cliff. On top of that, she brings absolutely nothing else to the team. No crowd control, no buffs, no debuffs, and no defensive utility. She's basically hoping that bigger numbers will solve every problem, and unfortunately, they usually don't. She's fine during the early game, but that's about where her career peaks. Next up is Chesia, another legendary guardian that really wants enemies to be burning before she starts dealing respectable damage. Sounds great, until you realize actually applying burn consistently is the hard part. She can inflict burn herself, but the chance is low enough that you can't reliably build a strategy around it. That usually means relying on another teammate to do the setup first. Even after investing resources into her upgrades, the increase in damage feels pretty underwhelming. She can still function as an area of effects damage dealer with damage over time effects during the early game, but she struggles to stay relevant afterward. Moving on to the epic guardians, Bjorn has an interesting gimmick. He summons a unit that helps shield your team from area of effect attacks, which can definitely save you in certain encounters. The problem is that this protective role is handled much better by several guardians sitting comfortably in the higher tiers. Those alternatives offer stronger defensive support without introducing the same vulnerabilities. Bjorn can still contribute some area of effect damage and has value early on, but he quickly gets overshadowed as your roster improves. Then there's Floki, another epic guardian whose biggest selling point is freeze. Completely locking enemies out of acting sounds amazing, and honestly, it is, when it actually leads to something. Unfortunately, Floki doesn't deal enough damage to capitalize on those frozen targets himself. Unless your entire team is built around extending and abusing his crowd control, he ends up feeling like someone who showed up with a great idea but forgot to bring the rest of the plan. His crowd control has moments to shine, but his overall offensive impact leaves a lot to be desired. Finally, we have Reddick and Helen, two legendary guardians that unfortunately never quite live up to their rarity. Reddick works as a tank by absorbing half of the damage taken by your highest health ally, giving your team a little extra breathing room during the early game. The issue is that his abilities have fairly long cooldowns, so that protection isn't available often enough when fights get tougher. His damage also fails to keep pace with stronger enemies, making other frontline guardians much more attractive choices. Helen has a similar problem. She can freeze enemies and deals bonus damage against targets already affected by crowd control, but her freeze application is entirely chance-based. When your entire strategy depends on luck, things rarely go smoothly. Add in her low base damage and weak scaling from upgrades, and she becomes one of the easiest legendary guardians to replace as your account progresses. The guardians in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right, Issa, Melissa, Nat, Nydia, Reyna, Sheely, Sycamore, Lucia, and Stella. Now we're getting into the part of the tier list where the guardians start feeling genuinely useful. These are the characters that can absolutely carry their weight through the early and middle portions of the game. They have solid strengths, some really fun mechanics, and in the right team, they can look surprisingly impressive. The catch is that almost all of them hit a wall eventually. Once you reach the toughest content, their flaws become much more noticeable, keeping them firmly in the B tier instead of climbing any higher. Let's kick things off with Issa, a legendary guardian that really enjoys fighting alongside teammates who constantly apply debuffs. The more debuffed your enemies are, the harder Issa hits, making her a strong damage per second option in the right composition. She also has the useful ability to remove one buff from enemies whenever she attacks, which can completely shut down certain opponents. She technically has access to stun as well, but the activation chance is simply too low to count on during important fights. Because of that, you'll mostly be using Issa as a damage dealer and buff remover throughout the early and middle stages of the game, rather than a reliable crowd control specialist. Melissa is another legendary guardian that loves making dramatic entrances. Her single target burst damage is excellent, and after the initial hit, she leaves enemies suffering from poison that slowly drains their health over time. Watching a boss melt from both direct damage and damage over time is definitely satisfying. Unfortunately, Melissa depends heavily on teammates keeping her alive. If your front line starts collapsing or your supports can't protect her consistently, her impressive damage quickly disappears. She's a fantastic burst damage dealer during the middle stages of the game, but keeping her relevant later requires much more effort than most players will want to invest. Sycamore focuses on making life miserable for the enemy's front line. This legendary guardian delivers powerful burst damage against frontline targets while applying Weaken, reducing both their damage output and overall effectiveness in battle. That's a great combination for progressing through the middle stages, especially when enemy tanks are causing problems. The downside is simple. Late game enemies become much tougher, and Sycamore's damage just doesn't scale well enough to keep up. She starts out looking like a future superstar, but eventually, stronger damage dealers take over her role without much difficulty. If setting everything on fire sounds like your kind of strategy, Shield might catch your attention. This legendary guardian spreads burn across the entire enemy team, dealing area of effects damage over time that slowly wears everyone down together. It's especially useful for farming and clearing groups of enemies. The only issue is that her active skill comes with a painfully long cooldown. That means burn isn't being refreshed nearly as often as you'd like, which ends up limiting her overall damage potential. She's still perfectly serviceable during the middle stages, but those long waits between activations can definitely feel frustrating. Moving over to the Epic Guardians, Nydia has one of the coolest mechanics in this tier. Once she enters her draconic form, her offensive power jumps dramatically, and nearby enemies start burning as she dishes out additional area of effect damage. The transformation genuinely feels powerful, and for a while she can dominate fights. The problem is that almost all of her value is tied to that single transformation. Outside of draconic form, her overall contribution drops significantly, making it difficult to justify keeping her on your roster once stronger, late game options become available. Nat is another epic guardian built around the burn, but instead of relying on one big transformation, she focuses on extending burn's duration to squeeze out even more damage over time during longer battles. Combined with her respectable raw damage, she performs extremely well throughout the early and middle portions of the game. Unfortunately, even after investing heavily into upgrades, Nat simply doesn't reach the damage numbers needed for late game content. She's reliable, she's consistent, and she's easy to use, but eventually the competition leaves her behind. Reyna and Lucia both fill supportive roles, although they go about it in different ways. Reyna keeps your strongest damage dealers alive by healing the two allies with the highest attack, while also applying burn that deals true damage, allowing her to chip away at enemies regardless of their defensive buffs. The problem is that her own damage is far too low, and the burn alone isn't enough to make up for it. Lucia, meanwhile, is one of the better healing-focused legendary guardians during the early and middle game. She restores the health of allies with the highest attack, removes 2 debuffs from teammates with the lowest health, and provides excellent sustain during difficult stages. Her only real weakness is that healing is basically all she offers. Outside of keeping everyone alive, she doesn't contribute much else to the fight. Last but definitely not least is Stella, a legendary guardian that loves starting battles with a bang. She opens fights by delivering massive single target burst damage before following up with a stun, creating the perfect opportunity for the rest of your team to unleash devastating combos. As battles continue, her damage scales upward, and her follow-up attacks keep chipping away at enemies, making her surprisingly effective in longer encounters. The downside is that her base damage isn't especially impressive at the start, so if fights end too quickly, ironically, she never gets the chance to reach her full potential. Even so, Stella remains one of the more enjoyable and dependable B-tier guardians to build around during the early and middle stages of Ever Night Reawakening. The guardians in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right, Alyssa, Berry, Boki, Eve, Hanok, Hyacinth, Icarus, Kent, May, Matthew, Samara, Yorg, Michelle, and Sharon. Now this is where the roster starts getting really interesting. These guardians are strong enough that you'll probably find yourself using several of them for a long time, and replacing them won't happen overnight. They have powerful abilities, useful utility, and can comfortably handle most of the game's content. They stop just short of the absolute best because each of them has at least one noticeable weakness, but don't let that fool you. An A-tier guardian is still someone you'll be happy to see on your team. Let's start with Hyacinth, a legendary guardian that absolutely loves boss fights. She begins every battle with a massive 48% damage bonus, and the healthier her target is, the harder she hits. That makes her incredibly effective at deleting huge chunks of a boss's health before the fight has even really started. The downside is that her damage bonus drops by 16% every turn unless she keeps securing eliminations to slow the decline. Against bosses that refuse to summon extra enemies, her early advantage gradually fades, but even then, she's still one of the strongest damage dealers available during the middle stages of the game. Hanok and Matthew are both fantastic choices if you enjoy shutting down dangerous enemies before they become a problem. Hanok specializes in bursting down the opponent with the highest attack, which often means removing the enemy team's biggest threat almost immediately. On top of that, he counterattacks every time he takes damage, giving opponents another reason to think twice before targeting him. Matthew takes a different approach by stealing 30% of an enemy's attack while dealing increased damage to whoever is standing directly in front of him. That combination of offensive debuffing and respectable damage makes him an excellent frontline support. Neither guardian scales particularly well into the late game, but throughout the middle stages, they perform exceptionally well. Kent is one of those guardians that completely changes personality once his signature ability activates. As soon as he transforms into his wolf form, he gains huge bonuses to both critical rate and critical damage, turning into a terrifying single target burst specialist. He also picks up permanent attack and defense bonuses between battles, helping him stay competitive as you progress. The only issue is that almost all of his damage depends on remaining in that transformed state. Once the wolf disappears, so does a large portion of his impact, making his performance feel a little inconsistent from fight to fight. If your team needs someone to keep everyone alive, Eve deserves serious attention. This legendary guardian focuses entirely on supporting your strongest damage dealers by healing the free allies with the highest attack whenever they need it most. Even better, after unlocking her Awaken ability, Eve can instantly revive herself after being defeated and jump straight back into the battle. It's a fantastic safety net during difficult encounters. The obvious trade-off is that she contributes almost no damage herself. Eve succeeds only if the rest of your team is capable of taking advantage of the extra survivability she provides. Berry and May both mix offense with utility, but they go about it in very different ways. Berry specializes in applying poison that deals true damage, allowing her to slowly wear down even heavily defended enemies that would normally shrug off standard attacks. She's excellent at breaking through defensive teams, but she's also incredibly fragile. Without a dedicated healer protecting her, she tends to disappear from the battlefield much faster than you'd like. May, meanwhile, becomes stronger the longer a fight lasts. She builds sunlight stacks that steadily increase her damage while also healing the two allies with the lowest health, giving her a nice balance between offense and sustain. She does require significant investment before both parts of her kit really shine, but once fully developed, she's a very rewarding guardian to use. Among the epic guardians, Alyssa proves that rarity isn't everything. She delivers heavy damage against frontline enemies while having the chance to inflict stun, opening the door for devastating follow-up attacks from the rest of your team. The problem is that stun depends entirely on chance, so there will always be those frustrating moments when you need it most and it simply refuses to happen. Boki follows a similar pattern by combining strong burst damage against the front row with poison that inflicts true damage over time. His damage is definitely respectable, but his active ability has a fairly long cooldown, making it difficult for him to maintain consistent damage per second throughout extended battles. Icarus is another epic guardian that punches above her weight. She focuses on healing the allies with the highest attack, ensuring your main damage dealers survive longer fights, while also removing crowd control effects from two teammates. That's an incredibly valuable combination during progression, especially when enemy control effects start becoming more common. The only reason she doesn't climb any higher is because legendary healers like Elizabeth and Misa simply restore health more efficiently. If you don't own those top tier supports yet, Icarus can absolutely fill the role without feeling like a downgrade. Samara and Jorg both specialize in eliminating priority targets, although they do it in completely different ways. Samara excels at destroying single enemies, making her perfect for boss stages or removing dangerous backline opponents before they become a problem. She also has a unique survival mechanic that converts accumulated energy into health, effectively allowing her to revive herself during difficult encounters. Jorg prefers a more explosive approach by attacking the enemy backline with heavy area of effect damage while gaining a shield that protects him for the next 2 turns. Both are excellent for specific stages, although Jorg becomes more inconsistent if he isn't supported by teammates capable of increasing his damage. Finally, we have Shun and Michelle, 2 legendary guardians that revolve around freeze and controlling the battlefield. Sharon deals impressive damage while freezing enemies, completely stopping them from taking actions, and she becomes even more dangerous against opponents already affected by other control effects. She's perfect for combo-focused teams, although her reliance on chaining those combinations keeps her from reaching the highest tier. Michelle is equally disruptive, delivering heavy damage to backline enemies while applying freeze to immediately throw enemy formations into chaos. She can even steal a percentage of an opponent's attack and use that stolen power against them, making difficult stages feel much more manageable. Her only real drawback is that she needs upgrades before her damage truly reaches its full potential. Even with that limitation, both Guardians are excellent examples of why A tier is packed with some of the most enjoyable characters to play in Ever Night Reawakening. The Guardians in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right, Andorra, Captain AL, Christo, Elizabeth, Haru, Misa, Selena, Victor, Leon, and Yolan. And finally, we've reached the Guardians that make you smile the moment they appear in your roster. These are the characters that stay relevant from the moment you unlock them all the way through the toughest endgame content. They don't just perform one role well, they often excel at several things at once. Whether you're pushing difficult stages, farming resources, taking on bosses, or building your ultimate team, these are the Guardians you'll keep coming back to. Let's begin with Haru, because this legendary Guardian is honestly ridiculous in the best possible way. She can grant invincibility to 2 allies, allowing them to completely ignore fatal damage during the most dangerous moments of a fight, while also boosting their damage at the same time. As if that wasn't enough, Haru can lock onto an enemy, transform them into a zombie, and eventually trigger a massive area of effect explosion that damages nearby opponents. It's one of the most unique abilities in Ever Night Reawakening, and it's exactly the kind of toolkit that stays useful in every single game mode from early progression all the way into the late game. Victor is another Guardian that seems to have an answer for almost every situation. This legendary frontline fighter gains lifesteal between battles, letting him recover naturally without constantly depending on healers. His damage also scales based on how many enemies are standing in front of him, making him an absolute monster during farming stages and wave-based content. On top of all that, Victor blocks incoming attacks to protect himself while silencing enemies at the same time. Tank, damage dealer, crowd control specialist. He somehow manages to fit all of those roles into a single character without feeling overloaded. If your team needs someone to keep everyone alive, Elizabeth is about as good as it gets. She heals 3 allies between battles, making long chains of encounters much safer because your team enters each new fight in much better condition. She also hands out both offensive and defensive buffs, improving your team's overall performance instead of simply restoring health. Then there's her signature ability, reviving a defeated ally and bringing them back with a large portion of their health restored. There are plenty of battles that feel completely lost until Elizabeth casually says, "Actually, we're not done yet." That single ability alone earns her a permanent place in the S tier. Christo proves that pure offense can absolutely earn a place among the very best. She applies vulnerable to frontline enemies, increasing the damage they receive, before summoning spirits that repeatedly attack those same targets. Those follow-up attacks aren't just flashy animations either. Her third skill becomes stronger depending on how many attacks those spirits land, allowing her damage per second to reach levels that very few Guardians can match. If your goal is deleting enemies before they get the chance to fight back, Christo is one of the strongest options available. Captain IL is basically the definition of a complete frontline guardian. She increases block rate for every ally on your team, helping everyone survive incoming attacks more consistently, while also reducing the damage she personally receives. That alone would already make her valuable. But she also deals impressive true damage, meaning she's contributing meaningful offense while protecting the entire team. Finding a guardian that can tank, support, and deal reliable damage all at once is incredibly rare, and that's exactly why Captain AL comfortably sits near the top of the rankings. Misa continues the trend of incredibly overloaded support guardians. Every time she attacks, she heals the allies with the lowest health while simultaneously providing defensive buffs that help them survive future attacks. She also applies vulnerable to enemies for 2 turns, increasing your team's damage against them, and removes crowd control effects from both herself and her teammates. In other words, Misa keeps your team alive, increases your damage, and prevents enemy control effects from ruining your strategy. That's about as close to an all-in-one support package as you can get. Now let's give some well-deserved attention to the epic guardians, because Andorra and Selene prove that rarity isn't everything. Andorra already deals excellent damage to every frontline enemy, but things become completely ridiculous once debuffs start stacking. Every additional debuff increases her damage even further, allowing her to compete directly with many legendary damage dealers. Pair her with a team that constantly spreads debuffs, and she'll remind you very quickly why she's sitting in the S tier. Selene takes a completely different approach by healing allies while boosting their offensive power at the same time. She can also remove crowd control effects from the center back row ally, making her incredibly valuable for protecting carefully planned team formations. Her flexibility makes her useful in virtually every type of content. Yolan is another support guardian that quietly carries entire teams without demanding much attention. She focuses her healing on the ally with the highest attack, ensuring your strongest damage dealer stays alive for as long as possible. Beyond healing, she also grants powerful critical hit and offensive buffs that increase your team's overall damage output. If that still wasn't enough, she lowers the enemy's critical resistance, making every critical hit from your carries even more devastating. She doesn't need flashy animations to prove her value because every part of her kit makes the rest of your roster perform better. Finally, we have Leon, a guardian that wraps up the S tier exactly the way you'd expect. He grants every ally an absorption shield, dramatically improving your team's survivability once late-game enemies start hitting like freight trains. As a frontline guardian, Leon also gains powerful defensive buffs that let him absorb enormous amounts of punishment without falling over. And because simply surviving apparently wasn't enough, he can also inflict stun on enemies, creating perfect opportunities for devastating team combos. When you combine outstanding tanking, reliable support, defensive buffs, and crowd control into one guardian, you end up with someone that deserves to stand among the absolute best characters in Ever Night Reawakening. The video ends here. See you in another video. Don't forget to subscribe.